Here we are 60 days in to your war of choice in Iran, and you can't give us an answer on a breakdown of the basic breakdown of American taxpayer dollars that have been spent in your war of choice? That's a question for Mr. Hurst. Right now, as you sit here now, you
We're
cannot...
happy to give you a breakdown. We'll provide you a product after this hearing.
Well, I would love for you to give us this breakdown now and explain to us, was this unbudgeted costs, or was this something the department planned for in advance, since you were appropriated $1 trillion last year?
The department deals with contingency operations all the time within its normal budget.
So this was not budgeted for. My point here is, you know, and General Kane, you've testified to this. We all understand, for you to do your jobs, you need Congress to pass budgets. For us to do our jobs, we need you to give us the details and to be accountable to American taxpayers. And so I gotta say, it's an extraordinary dereliction that as you sit here, you cannot account for billions of dollars that have already been spent.
You're briefed on munitions every week. You and your entire staff have every, just so the American public know, it's not as if you don't have munitions levels. You do from us every single week. So you know exactly the numbers you're talking about.
Mr. Hegseth, you have testified that American taxpayers need to know where their dollars are going. And as you sit here today, you can't provide us with a basic answer to the most simple question that you should be able to answer to each and every American taxpayer.
You're asking a question to an answer with an answer you already have.
No, I'm asking you for a breakdown where you said you will be accountable for every taxpayer dollar. You cannot tell us where any of the $25 billion in taxpayer funds that have gone to fund your war of choice in Iran.
Congresswoman Maggie Goodlander just confronted Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth with a simple question. You have spent $25 billion on the war in Iran in 60 days, a war the administration chose to start, not a defensive response to an attack on U.S. soil. That is over $400 million per day. Where did that money go? Hegseth could not answer. He said he would provide a breakdown after the hearing. Goodlander pressed again. You testified repeatedly that you would be accountable for every American taxpayer dollar. We are 60 days into this war and you cannot provide a basic breakdown of how $25 billion was spent. Hegseth deflected to Mr. Hurst. Hurst said they would provide a product with a detailed breakdown later. That is not an answer. That is a delay. Goodlander then pointed out the stakes. The Department of Defense has failed 8 audits. That means independent auditors examined the department's financial records and could not verify where the money went. The department remains on the Government Accountability Office's high-risk list for financial management. The Inspector General identified billions of dollars in question costs just last year alone, spending that raised red flags. And now the Secretary is asking for $1.5 trillion in the next budget. But when asked how $25 billion was spent in the last 60 days, he cannot provide details. He is briefed on munitions every week. His staff reports munitions expenditures to Congress every single week. He knows exactly what the numbers are, but he will not say them out loud. Then Goodlander asked about gas prices. What was the average cost of a gallon of gas on February 28th, the day before the war in Iran began? Hegseth said it depends on where you live. The answer was $2.83. What is the average cost today? Hegseth said much higher in California. The answer is $14.23. That is a 50% increase in 60 days. Goodlander pointed out that Hegseth claims he has a crack economic team analyzing the impact of this war on American taxpayers. But he cannot answer the most basic question about gas prices. He knows munitions numbers every week. He does not know gas prices. This channel tracks the documentation as it moves through the legal system. If you want to follow where this goes, subscribe and turn on notifications. New videos drop when the record produces something worth documenting. This is not a budget hearing. This is an accounting. $25 billion spent, no breakdown. Let's watch the full exchange.
Chair, and I we're going to recognize the gentlelady from New Hampshire, Ms. Goodlander.
I want to thank our witnesses for being here today, and I want to begin by getting right to it, since my time is limited, on this $1.5 trillion budget request. Mr. Hegseth, you testified last year and you testified again today that you will be accountable for every American taxpayer dollar that comes to the department, where it goes and why. That's really important since, as it's been pointed out, the department has failed 8 audits. The department remains on GAO's high-risk list. The Inspector General just last year alone identified billions of dollars that could have been put to better use. and in questioned costs, that is spending that raised red flags. So this is a crisis right now in accountability of where the dollars of the American taxpayers who are in the middle of a cost crisis, where this money is going. I want to ask about your war in Iran. And Mr. Hurst, you testified earlier today that $25 billion has been spent to date. I just want to clarify that that is money, that taxpayer dollars that have been spent already in this war.
$25 reflects the costs of the war, right? So we've already spent the dollars on munitions and things like that. So we're factoring in cost of munitions expended into that total.
So how much of that has gone towards munitions? Does that include the munitions that have been spent to date?
Yeah, that reflects the munitions that have been spent to date and other operational costs.
Can you give us a breakdown of what those costs are?
We'll work to get you guys a product that has a detailed breakdown of those costs.
Yeah, my concern here is, Mr. Hegseth, you've testified repeatedly that you're going to be accountable for each and every American taxpayer dollar that you spend, that you're going to be accountable for the rationale. Here we are 60 days in to your war of choice in Iran, and you can't give us an answer on a breakdown of the basic breakdown of American taxpayer dollars that have been spent in your war of choice? That's a question for Mr. Hurst. You, right now, as you sit here now, you
We're
cannot...
happy to give you a breakdown. We'll provide you a product after this hearing.
Well, I would love for you to give us this breakdown now and explain to us, was this unbudgeted costs, or was this something the department planned for in advance, since you were appropriated $1 trillion last year?
The department deals with contingency operations all the time within its normal budget.
So this was not budgeted for. My point here is, you know, and General Kane, you've testified to this. We all understand, for you to do your jobs, you need Congress to pass budgets. For us to do our jobs, we need you to give us the details and to be accountable to American taxpayers. And so I got to say, it's an extraordinary dereliction that as you sit here, you cannot account for billions of dollars that have already been spent.
You're
in this
briefed
war.
on munitions every week. You and your entire staff have every,
asking
just so the American public know, it's not
Mr.
as if you
Hegseth,
don't have munitions levels.
Mr.
You do
Hegseth,
from us every single week. So
Mr.
you know
Hegseth,
exactly the numbers you're
Mr.
talking
Hegseth,
about.
you have testified that American taxpayers need to know where their dollars are going. And as you sit here today, you can't provide us with a basic answer to the most simple question that you should be able to answer to each and every American
You're
taxpayer.
asking a question to an answer with an answer you already have.
No, I'm asking you for a breakdown where you said you will be accountable for every taxpayer dollar. You cannot tell us where any of the $25 billion in taxpayer funds that have gone to fund your war of choice in Iran. And I look forward to getting details from our witnesses after this hearing, because the American taxpayers need to know. Mr. Hegseth, can I ask you, do you know what the average cost of a gallon of gas was in this country on February 28th?
Well, it depends on where you live. If you live in California, it's $8.
$2.83. Do you know what the average cost of a gallon of gas is today?
Much higher in California.
$4.23. I gotta say, Mr. Hegseth, you said you've got a crack economic team that's looking at the impacts of this war on the American taxpayer, and you can't answer this basic question. That should shock the conscience of every American. General Kane, I want to come back to something, a really important principle, and my time is limited. You testified to an important and bedrock principle of American law, that our service members follow lawful orders and lawful orders only. Is that right? Do you agree with the statement, quote, the military won't follow unlawful orders?
I do.
Mr. Hegseth, do you agree with that statement?
I do, but understand what you're insinuating at a partisan point.
I'm not. I'm actually quoting you directly, Mr. Hegseth, from April 12th, 2016. And I appreciate that on the record, you've clarified this important principle of American
Gentlelady's
law.
time's expired. Chair, now
Let's go through what just happened, because what you just witnessed was a 5-minute masterclass in congressional oversight. Congresswoman Maggie Goodlander asked the Secretary of Defense to account for $25 billion in taxpayer spending on a 60-day-old war in Iran. The Secretary could not provide a breakdown of where that money went, not because the information does not exist, because he chose not to provide it. Congresswoman Maggie Goodlander started by establishing the context. The Department of Defense is requesting $1.5 trillion in its next budget. That is trillion with a T. The department has failed 8 audits. An audit is when independent accountants examine financial records to verify where money went. The Department of Defense cannot pass that test. It remains on the Government Accountability Office's high-risk list for financial management. The Inspector General identified billions of dollars in questioned costs just last year alone. Questioned costs mean spending that raised red flags, expenses that could not be verified, contracts not documented, payments to unclear recipients. That is documented failure to account for taxpayer money. And now the department is asking Congress for more money while conducting a war in Iran that has already cost $25 billion in 60 days. Goodlander asked a direct question. How much of that $25 billion has gone towards munitions? Mr. Hurst, the department's comptroller testifying alongside Hegseth, said that figure reflects the munitions that have been spent to date and other operational costs. Goodlander asked for a breakdown. What are those costs? Munitions, missiles, bombs, ammunition, operational costs, fuel, logistics, troop deployment, maintenance. Hurst said they would work to get Congress a product with a detailed breakdown. That is not an answer. That is a promise to provide an answer later. Congress does not appropriate money based on promises. Congress appropriates money based on budgets. And the department is refusing to provide one. Goodlander turned to Hegseth. You have testified repeatedly that you will be accountable for every American taxpayer dollar that comes to the department, where it goes, and why. We are 60 days into your war of choice in Iran, and you cannot give us a breakdown of how $25 billion in taxpayer dollars was spent. Hegseth said that is a question for Mr. Hurst. Think about that deflection. Hegseth is the Secretary of Defense. He is the civilian leader of the department. He is the one who testifies to Congress. He is the one who promises accountability. And when asked to fulfill that promise, he points to someone else. Goodlander pushed back. You are the Secretary of Defense. You are accountable. Can you provide the breakdown now? Hegseth said they would be happy to provide a product after the hearing. Happy to provide it later. Not able to provide it now. Goodlander asked whether this was unbudgeted spending or whether the department had planned for it in advance. The department was appropriated $1 trillion last year. Was this $25 billion included in that appropriation or not? Hegseth said the department deals with contingency operations all the time within its normal budget. Goodlander clarified. So this was not budgeted for. Hegseth did not confirm or deny. He simply moved on. Then Goodlander made a critical point. For the Department of Defense to do its job, Congress needs to pass budgets. For Congress to do its job, the department needs to provide details and be accountable to American taxpayers. And as Hegseth sat there, he could not account for billions of dollars that had already been spent. Goodlander called it what it is, an extraordinary dereliction of duty. That is not partisan language. That is a legal and constitutional description of failure to fulfill the responsibilities of office. Goodlander pointed out that Hegseth is briefed on munitions every week. His entire staff tracks munitions expenditures. They know how many missiles were fired. They know how many bombs were dropped. They know the cost per unit. They know the total. This is not information the department lacks. This is information the department tracks in real time. Hegseth is not lacking information. He is refusing to provide it in a public hearing. Hegseth has testified repeatedly that American taxpayers need to know where their dollars are going. But when asked for a basic breakdown of $25 billion in spending, he said he would provide a product later. That is not accountability. That is delay. Hegseth tried to deflect. He said Goodlander was asking a question to which she already had the answer. Goodlander corrected him. No, I am asking you for a breakdown where you said you would be accountable for every taxpayer dollar. You cannot tell us where billions of dollars in taxpayer funds have gone to fund your war of choice in Iran. That distinction matters. Goodlander was not asking for information she already had. She was asking Hegseth to state it on the record in a public hearing. Why does that matter? Because oversight is not a private conversation. Oversight is a public process. When the Secretary of Defense tells Congress he will be accountable for every taxpayer dollar, and then refuses to account for $25 billion in a public hearing, that refusal is itself the record. It is documentation of failure to fulfill the promise. Then Goodlander shifted to gas prices. What was the average cost of a gallon of gas in this country on February 28th, the day before the war in Iran began? Hegseth said it depends on where you live. If you live in California, it is $8. Notice the deflection. Goodlander asked for the national average. Hegseth answered with California. California has the highest gas prices in the country. Citing California is a way to avoid citing the national figure. Goodlander gave him the answer. The national average on February 28th was $2.83. She then asked what the average cost of gas is today. Hegseth said much higher in California. Again, that was not the question. The answer is $4.23. Gas prices have increased by $1.40 per gallon, a 50% increase, in the 60 days since the war in Iran began. And the Secretary of Defense, who claims to have a crack economic team analyzing the impact of this war on American taxpayers, could not state those figures. Goodlander pointed out that Hegseth has claimed publicly he has a crack economic team analyzing the impacts of this war on the American taxpayer. If that team exists, and if they are analyzing impacts, they would know gas prices. They would know the national average before the war. They would know the national average today. They would know the percentage increase. And they would brief the Secretary before he testifies to Congress. But when asked the most basic question about gas prices, a number every American sees at the pump, Hegseth could not answer it. That should shock the conscience of every American. The Secretary of Defense is conducting a $25 billion war. Gas prices have increased 50% in 60 days, and he cannot state the national average price of gas before or after the war started. Either the economic team does not exist, or the Secretary is not listening to them, or he is choosing not to share their findings with Congress. Then Goodlander shifted topics. She wanted to test whether Hegseth still holds the same principles he publicly stated in 2016. She asked General Kane whether he agrees with the bedrock principle of American law that service members follow lawful orders and lawful orders only. Kane said he does. Goodlander asked Hegseth the same question. Do you agree with that statement? Hegseth said he does, but added that he understands what Goodlander is insinuating with a partisan point. Goodlander corrected him. She was not insinuating anything. She was quoting Hegseth directly from April 12, 2016, when he made that exact statement. She was asking him to confirm on the record that he still believes it. Why does that matter? Because the principle that service members do not follow unlawful orders is a constitutional safeguard. If the Secretary believes it in 2016 but calls it partisan in 2026, that is a shift worth documenting. Here is what we know. The Department of Defense has spent $25 billion on the war in Iran in 60 days. That is over $400 million per day. When Congresswoman Goodlander asked for a breakdown of that spending, how much went to munitions, how much went to operational costs, Secretary Hegseth said he would provide a product after the hearing. That is not an answer. That is a delay. When asked whether the $25 billion was budgeted or unbudgeted spending, Hegseth said the department deals with contingency operations all the time within its normal budget. That is not a yes or no. That is evasion. When asked about the national average price of gas before the war started, Hegseth deflected to California. When asked about the national average today, he deflected again. The correct answers are $2.83 and $4.23, a 50% increase in 60 days, and the Secretary could not state those numbers. When pressed on accountability, when reminded that he himself testified he would account for every taxpayer dollar, Hegseth accused Goodlander of asking questions she already knew the answers to. But that misses the point. Oversight is not about whether the Congresswoman knows the answer. Oversight is about whether the Secretary will provide the answer on the record in a public hearing. And he would not. This is not how oversight works. Congress appropriates money. The executive branch spends it. And when Congress asks where the money went, the executive branch is required to provide an answer, not a promise to provide an answer later, not a deflection to someone else, an answer. Secretary Hegseth is briefed on munitions expenditures every week. His staff tracks costs in real time. He knows the breakdown of the $25 billion. He knows how much went to missiles. He knows how much went to fuel. He knows how much went to troop deployment. He has that information. He chose not to provide it in a public hearing. That choice is itself a form of accountability failure. When a cabinet official refuses to answer a direct question from Congress in a public hearing, that refusal becomes the record. And the record now shows that 60 days into a $25 billion war, the Secretary of Defense will not account for where the money went. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you want the full record, not the sound bites. Federal Echo covers what was said, what was not said, and what the refusals mean. Share your thoughts in the comments. I read them all. How much of $25 billion in taxpayer money was spent on munitions in your war in Iran? Goodlander asked. Hegseth said he would provide a breakdown later. The Secretary of Defense cannot account for billions of dollars already spent. That is the answer.